Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up, so that means we're about ready to get started. I was going to say good morning, but I'm thinking that not everyone here is experiencing morning. So, hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. My name is Jessie Mewshaw, and I'm so excited to be talking to you today about Gestalt language processing. I am going to present some slides. I do have some information I want to make sure that I talk about. We have a short amount of time today to get into a really, really deep and interesting topic, and I'm going to try my best to load us up with as much really good information as possible. But of course, if you have questions at the end of this presentation, I will be spending the last couple of minutes answering some of those questions. And I'm also going to give you my contact information so you can stay in touch with me and we can continue learning and talking about this interesting topic together. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. I am also going to be providing these slides at the end of the presentation so that if you want to have access to these, I'm going to make sure that those are available. Sorry, let me try that again. Because I know sometimes it is nice to have something to come back to. I'm having a little trouble sharing my screen. It says your screen sharing is paused. I don't know what that means. Let me go out of it and try it again. I'm just going to close some of my other windows and see if that's helpful. Try to pull up the right ones this time. There we go. Okay. Sorry for the technical difficulties, you guys. I am good at talking about this topic, but I am not as good at technology. That is my kryptonite. Let's see if we can get it. Okay, there we go. And let me go into present mode. Okay, so the title of this presentation is Introduction to Gestalt Language Processing and the Natural Language Acquisition Framework, which I am going to tell you a little bit about today. I did another version of this presentation, a little bit more in depth recently, and for this presentation, I did have this slide deck peer-reviewed by Marge Blanc, who you're going to hear a little bit more about as we get into this topic. Marge Blanc is a very influential SLP, speech-language pathologist in the field that specializes in Gestalt language, so I was really, really happy and proud to have her as a supporter preparing for this presentation and several others on the same topic. So really, really quickly, a little bit about me. I am a pediatric speech-language therapist. I am working in the United States in North Carolina in the Chapel Hill area. I'm in private practice and I've been practicing for about 11 years now and primarily work with autistic kids and teens across the lifespan, from kids 18 months of age all the way through 18 years of age. Prior to becoming an SLP, I did work with disabled kids and adults in the US as well as abroad in South America and Australia, which I think was really influential in helping me find my career path and really helped me to have some of that really hands-on experience prior to getting my master's degree and becoming a speech therapist. I think it was maybe as important, if not more important than the education I had in the classroom, was like really working in communities across the world. I am dedicated to providing services that respect the neurodiversity movement, respect the autistic neurotype, and advocating for inclusive supports throughout the community. I am neurodivergent myself. I have ADHD, and I am also parent to 2 neurodivergent children. So that's a quick snippet about me. In my spare time, when I'm not doing therapy with kids and teens, I really like to provide trainings. I like to do parent coaching. I like to create materials that are educational and help share information that is supportive of supporting the autistic community and specifically helping people to better understand autistic kids and teens. Before I get into this slide, I just want to give a little bit of background information about how I became interested in this topic. And we are going to dive into more of like what Gestalt language is. But I wanted to share a really quick story that sort of illustrates my journey here. I love to tell this story. One of the first autistic people that I knew in my life takes me back to daycare. So I was probably somewhere in the range of maybe 4 or 5 years old. This was prior to beginning my formal school education, which in the US starts around the age of 5 with kindergarten. And there was another child at my daycare who was autistic, and I now recognize was a Gestalt language processor. And I was very interested in this individual because I recognized that he processed language and the world and communicated very differently than all of the other kids that I knew. I also really enjoyed the way that he played, which was very, very different from the ways that a lot of other kids played. And what that looked like was this child primarily communicated and played through using large scripts, things that he had memorized either from things that he had heard other people say or things that at that time we didn't really have the internet, we didn't have YouTube, we didn't have all of that, but we had television. So he mostly at that time memorized movies and TV shows, and he could memorize large amounts of information from an entire episode of a show we have here called Jeopardy to an entire movie. I remember walking next to him and he would script an entire movie that I had watched, and I just thought, God, this is so incredibly cool that he can remember and recite this entire movie from memory. And from that point on, I was just fascinated by the ways that other people could process information, process the world, and use language in a way that was very different from the way that I did. And that sort of started me off on my journey here. We are going to do a little bit of diving into some of the vocabulary, but I just want to maybe upfront say that some of the words you might hear when we talk about Gestalt language processing or Gestalt language, some of the words you're going to hear people use are things like scripting, echolalia, repeated language. These words primarily all mean the same thing. We're all talking about Gestalt language. So we'll talk about a little bit more of the vocabulary in just a moment. But I do like to usually start my presentations by recognizing what evidence base in the field of speech language pathology really is and how important it is that we pay attention to all three of the prongs when it comes to evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice is the gold standard, of course, for any type of therapy in this field, and we need to acknowledge all the pieces there. People often talk about the research, and the research is very important, but it is but one of the three prongs that we really need to be attending to when it comes to developing our evidence-based practice and translating that into the therapy that we do with our clients. The other pieces of evidence-based, and this I should mention comes from ASHA, which is the overseeing governing body in the United States for SLPs, speech language pathologists. The other two prongs of that evidence base are our clinical experiences. So what we gather from our clinical experiences working in the field, boots on the ground, working with clients, the knowledge that we gain through those experiences, what works, what doesn't, how different kids show up. And then the other really, really important piece is listening to and analyzing and integrating the lived experience of the populations we serve into everything we do. And to me, that is the most important prong of this. So listening to the lived experience of autistic adults who grew up as Gestalt language processors, maybe still are Gestalt language processors, and can share what their experience was growing up, scripting, using echolalia, how other people responded to that, and how that made them feel, how it supported their language journey, how it made them feel like a complete communicator who could be understood and validated by the other people around them. That is a really big piece of everything that I do, and I integrate that into, of course, my trainings as well. All right, let's go to the next slide so we can really dive in. Okay, really quickly going to go over some of the terminology you might hear me use, or if you're learning more about Gestalt language, you will probably hear these terms quite often. The first one is ALP, which stands for Analytic Language Processor. This is the language processing style that most of us know and understand. If you're in the United States, for example, and if you're going to have a baby, this is usually what most of the apps that are there to help you guide, checking in on your child's development. Are they hitting their milestones? or maybe your pediatrician is going to share that information with you. There's lots of places, websites, et cetera, where you're going to see this information about how quote unquote language should develop. And usually what they're referring to is the analytic style of language development. But what we now know is that there isn't just one style of language development. There's not one way that this happens. There actually are several, and Gestalt language processing or Gestalt language development is one of those other ways. It is just not shared predominantly in the mainstream, but it is really important that we know, especially if we have a child who is of a different neurotype, right? If we have a child who is ADHD, autistic, or maybe the two of those together, which is ADHD, you might see that they develop language differently. Different is not bad, it is just different. And we just need to have another framework of development so we can make sure that our children are meeting their milestones. If they need support, they have support, and that we can help them along the way. Okay, so GLP stands for Gestalt Language Processor, and this again is just another style of language development, which we are going to get into a little bit more in depth. Echolalia, as I also mentioned already, is just repeated language using the intonation that the language was originally heard using. They can be long strings of language. They can also be super short as only one word. And then NLA is the Natural Language Acquisition Framework, which is one framework that is currently being used by SLPs who are GLP informed and are supporting GLPs with their language journey. We'll talk a little bit about that and some history with that as well. Okay, I'm not going to read over all of the history here because there simply is not time for it. But if you want to come back to this and read it later, I will again make sure that you have the slides. But I really wanted to keep this in here just so everybody could see how long this has actually been around. Gestalt language processing and NLA actually is not new. It is new to many of us, but it is not new stuff. This stuff has been around since the 70s. It is just now really coming into the mainstream because of social media and the accessibility of internet and everything on the internet. It's finally becoming more mainstream that people understand and are diving into this, but it's been around for a very long time. Some of the names that you're going to hear when you dive into better understanding GLP and the history behind it are Ann Peters, Barry Prezant, who is another SLP, who's been working with autistic folks for as long as he's been in the career and has tons of amazing published works in relation to this. And I would also just highlight that Barry Prezant has an incredible podcast called Uniquely Human, which is also the name of an incredible book that he's written. And I highly recommend that book. I think it's a fantastic book to read if you are somebody who loves or supports autistic people. Marge Blanc is a huge name in this field as well and has really dedicated her career to supporting GLPs and having society at large better understand GLPs. And then Alex Zakos is another SLP who is really big in this field and has really brought the more attention onto it in recent years. And I am trained in the Natural Language Acquisition Framework, and I did Alex Zakos training, which was largely informed by Marge Blanc. So all of these people are really incredible people in this field, and we owe a lot of what we know to these folks. So we're really, really thankful for them. I'm going to show you a couple of visuals to hopefully help highlight what the differences are between analytic language development and Gestalt language development. And I'm going to try to break it down pretty simply. Analytic language development, sorry if you hear some jingling and noise in the background. I have two cats who are very excited that I'm home and they're making a lot of noise and playing in the background. Analytic language development is the language development style that we are more used to hearing about. When babies first developing language around 12 months or 1 year of age, they're going to usually develop a single word, and then they're going to slowly add on with more single words. Around 18 months to 2 years, we're going to hear them start combining words. Maybe they started with cookie and now they can say want cookie or mommy cookie, and they start putting two words together. And then we build from there, sort of like steps leading up, single word, two word combinations, maybe some early phrases, 3 and 4 words together, and then they're going to build to conversational from there. That's what most of us are used to hearing about when we talk about language development. But Gestalt language development, that's going to look a little bit different. And I do have another visual that I'm going to show you that I think, in my mind, makes a lot more sense of how this works. But Gestalt language processors, on the other hand, instead of starting with single words, are often going to start with larger chunks of language. It might be an entire sentence, it might be a paragraph, it might be a phrase. It can also be a single word, which is a little confusing. But there are ways that we can tell the difference between a single word that is referential, like an analytic language developer would develop, or a single word that actually represents a gestalt in more of the GLP style of language development. So they're going to start with these larger chunks. And then as they develop language and as they go through the development stages, they're going to go from those larger chunks to more pared down versions of that chunk. And then when they get to sort of the middle area of their development, that's when they're going to start developing those single referential words that ALP started with. So they're sort of going to get to that same place. They're just taking a different route to get there. From that point, they're then going to develop those early phrases, sentences, and spontaneous language that we expect really all children to gain so that they eventually are conversational. So the end game is the same, the end place is the same for many GLPs, but getting there is just a different route. This is another just another slide with examples from Marge Blanc. This is from her website of what that might look like. I'm going to skip over this for now just to make sure we can get to everything we want to talk about today. And I thought I had another visual here, but maybe I put it somewhere else. Let's see if I put it over here. Okay, we'll see if I come back to it. But I'm going to read to you a little bit about the other characteristics of GLPs that we often see in this population that really help us to understand, like, how is this child processing language? Many GLPs process language using kind of the sound stream of the language that they hear around them. They're not necessarily honing in on those single words and picking those out and going, oh, cookie, and that means this. And then if I say cookie, sometimes I get a cookie and then I can eat it. But rather they're taking in the whole, okay? They're often very musically aligned and very attracted to music and intonation and musicality. And we often see that GLPs are scripting or using echolalia or gestalts using the same intonation that they first heard that language used in. So if I say to a GLP, let's get out of here, and then they pick that up as language that they find valuable and that they want to use to communicate, they might repeat that always in that same way. Let's get out of here, with that exact same prosody and intonation where they originally heard that language used. There are two types of echolalia. There's immediate echolalia, which is when a child repeats back what you've said immediately after it's been said. This is often used for a few different for different purposes. One of them is for processing the language that was just heard. So if you said something to a child like, we need some help, and then they say back, we need some help, it might be that they're processing what was just said, and maybe they're then storing that in memory as well, so that they can come back and use that later. They also might be using it as a way to take a conversational turn if the language that they really need in that moment is not yet available because they haven't moved along those stages of development yet. It might be that using immediate echolalia is a way for them to take that conversational turn. It can also be used to confirm or respond to what you've just said. So sometimes if I say, let's get some help, and a kid says, let's get some help, or they may even pare that down and say, get help, I will then validate that and say, okay, I'm going to give you some help, as if they said to me, yes, that is what I need. And there are ways that we can fine tune our practice to better understand why a child is using immediate echolalia so we can respond to it appropriately. Delayed echolalia is when language that has been heard from another source, whether it be another person, YouTube, a TV show, the radio, the GPS even, right? There's lots of ways that we take in language. That language could then be stored by the GLP as a whole and then used later. Something that's really important to note about echolalia in this first and initial stage of Gestalt language development is that we can't always interpret the language literally. And I think that is a really important thing to note. Some GLPs are quite savvy and use language in a really savvy way where it can be used quite literally. Other times, GLPs are using language that can't necessarily be interpreted quite literally, and you have to really do some detective work to find out what is the meaning behind that language for the individual, and then how can I then support and respond to it appropriately. let's see if I can, yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about a lot of this comes from Ann Peters, and then some of it comes from Marge Blanc as well. I'm going to read a little bit of this because I think it's really good stuff to think about when you're thinking about GLPs. Gestalts are the soundtrack of meaningful experiences. They may be intonationally defined and very often carry a unit of meaning. GLPs were referred to as intonation babies in the early research. They are sometimes incorrectly diagnosed as having an articulation or phonological delay. So that's when an SLP, a speech therapist, might diagnose a child with having a speech sound delay. Sometimes that happens with GLPs because when they are young and they're repeating these large sentences, these large gestalts with many, many words in it, they might jumble them all together because they're focused more on that intonation than on articulating each word. So sometimes a gestalt, especially in a young child, might come out as where you're hearing that intonation, but you're not really hearing the borders and this each individual sound of each of those words. Sometimes this happens because the child is more focused on intonation. It can also happen, especially in a young child, because motorically, in terms of motor skills, they are really not yet able to make all the sounds that are needed to articulate that long stream of words in a really articulate way, like an adult might, because children develop their speech sound capacity over time. When you're 2, 3 years old, you're not expected to be able to make all of the sounds in a particular language yet because your motor skills haven't quite caught up. It doesn't mean that the child necessarily has an articulation or speech delay. It could mean that their motor system just hasn't caught up to what they're trying to say yet. And I do think it is important to be able to differentiate the two. Can a GLP also have a speech sound disorder? Absolutely. And we're going to talk about that a little bit at the end. Hopefully, we're going to have time to get to it. If not, I'll make sure that you guys can read this yourself later. GLPs progress through their language journeys, starting with gestalts, pruning them down and mitigating them and making them shorter, arriving then at those single words, and then they can finally build up and go up those stairs by building their own utterances. Okay, this is Marge Blanc. She's amazing. I don't want to read all of this right now, but she is, in my opinion, sort of the mother of the NLA framework and really like an influential person in the field of GLP. She's also just a kind, helpful person, always there to help anyone who's on this journey and wanting to support GLPs and really help them with their language journey. She is always available to support. And I love her for that. The NLA framework is a framework for naturally assessing and supporting the language journeys of GLPs. It's really what's in the name. It is natural. It is such a wonderful and beautiful way to do language therapy with GLPs because it really respects where they are in their journey, and we are just there to help them along the way. It's really beautiful doing therapy in this way, and I'm so thankful to have found this method of working with GLPs. Really briefly going to talk through the stages. There are 6 stages currently in the NLA framework. Number 1 is starting with those large whole gestalts. It could be an entire sentence, for example. One that is often used when we talk about GLPs, which I think originally came from Alex Zakos, is to infinity and beyond, which is a quote from a movie, Toy Story, that is very popular here in the US. To infinity and beyond is a gestalt that a child might gain from watching that movie. It might have a meaning to them that is much far beyond those words. Maybe to them that means, I want to see the whole world. Maybe to them that was just a very exciting part of the movie. And to them, it is how they express excitement, right? There really might be a non-literal meaning behind that gestalt that one would really have to dig deep and understand how they gain that language and how they're using it to better understand what it means for the child. If, for example, we take that language and we move into stage 2 of the NLA framework, a child might then start paring down that original gestalt. So instead of saying to infinity and beyond, they might pare it down to and beyond, or any version of that pared down. Another way we can mitigate original gestalts is by putting one part of one gestalt together with another part of another gestalt. And that's called mixing and matching, where you put 2 pieces or 2 mini chunks together to create something new. Mitigated gestalts can also be frame and slot, where a child says, it's a, and then fill in the blank. It's a ball. It's a guitar, whatever it is. It's a chair. That's a frame and slot. So they have like this first kind of sentence starter piece that doesn't change, and they just fill in that last part. Stage 3 is those isolated single words. They are referential in nature. So you're really able to then, at this stage, point at things and label things that you see in the environment. We focus a lot on nouns, prepositions, and descriptive terms when we're in this stage to make sure that kids can really robustly beef up their vocabulary for referential words in their environment at this stage. And then from then on, they're working on developing a full grammar system from early phrases through more complex phrases, all the way through an advanced grammar system so that they then have the words to say anything that they want. They don't have to necessarily rely on scripts to get their meaning across, but really can build their own language from scratch. When kids get to stage 6, that does not mean that echolalia and gestalts go away. They are often preserved and still drawn upon, and GLPs who even have made it through all the way to the end, we don't want to get rid of gestalts. We don't want to get rid of echolalia. That is the beautiful part of their early language that I love to have preserved. It's something that they can also fall back on if they're stressed, if they're anxious, if they're upset, and their access to that higher level language is not available. They might go back to using those gestalts. It gives us really good data about where a child is. And I think it's really important that they're able to preserve that. I'm looking at the time and I'm noticing that I'm already supposed to be doing Q&A. So I'm just going to really quickly, here's that visual that I wanted to show you. This is how I usually am sort of envisioning the Gestalt language journey in like an hourglass shape, right? So it's bigger, we pare it down, we get to single words, and then we build back up again. Let's see if there's anything super important I want to make sure I highlight before we move on. This gets into the therapy components that can be really important for an SLP working with a Gestalt language processor. Like I said, it's very natural. It's play-based. It's child-led. It's doing a ton of modeling. We're not peppering questions at the child. We are not modeling language and then making the child repeat it back. That's not how this is done. It's very, very natural. It's language offering and invitations for language, modeling language we think the child might find useful, and then letting them decide what is important for them and what they are then going to store and use. It is incredibly effective, even though it sounds like it's just like a really casual layback thing. And it is. It's a blast. Kids really, really enjoy it, and it is incredibly effective. We really center the child's experience and regulation. It's also really, really important to get kids moving. Intersectionality. I think I have 1 or 2 more slides. Okay, good. I'm getting the green light. That is okay if I take a little bit more time. I think it is really important when we're talking about Gestalt language processors to also understand that it is a larger processing style. It is not just the way that one processes language, but it can also be the way that one processes the world. It is truly a cognitive style of understanding and processing the world. You will see it show up in play. You will see it show up in so many other aspects of life, and better understanding this aspect of a child that you love, maybe it's your own child, or children that you support, maybe your teacher or therapist, whatever. It's so important that we understand that people can process the world differently, and that is okay. Trying to see the world through their eyes is the best way for us to connect and better support individuals that we work with or that are part of our family. GLPs can also be non-speaking, minimally speaking, or unreliably speaking. And truly, that is a whole nother presentation to understand how we identify a child as GLP, especially if they're non-speaking. But it's important that we know that so we can support them, especially if we're using something like AAC to help them with communication. We're going to want to implement a lot of these GLP strategies with what we do. GLPs can also be bilingual. They can also have co-occurring conditions like motor disorders or have a PDA profile, which if you were at the last presentation I did with Autism Connect, that was the topic I discussed last time. There are lots of other co-occurring conditions that can occur. It's really important that teams collaborate to support GLPs and really all share some shared language and understanding about this language processing style so we can all support kids holistically and together. And the last, I think we're at the last slide, you guys. in terms of information. This last slide, oh, sorry, no, I do have some just some therapy sample goals that you can look at later across the different stages of language development for GLPs. I'll leave those there so you can look at later, all the way through from 1 to 6. Maybe if there's some SLPs here, that might be helpful. And then this final note is from a friend of mine, Bettina, who is a GLP. She's autistic, and she grew up processing language in a GLP style. So I'm going to quickly read this. As a GLP kid, gestalts were my anchors, the words I held onto when everything felt too big, too unpredictable. I repeated what felt safe, what made sense, what carried meaning beyond just words. Phrases from movies, songs, my parents, teachers, each one wrapped in emotion and connection. Now, as an adult, my brain still holds onto them like familiar melodies. Some bring comfort, some I've had to unlearn, some I've rewritten to fit the person I'm becoming. Gestalts weren't just how I spoke, they were how I felt seen. And even now, they remind me that language isn't just about words, it's about rhythm, safety, and the echoes of who we are. I just adore that. I think that is so beautiful and really beautifully sums up what we've talked about here today. That is it. I want to let you know that I am available by email at jessiesue.smith@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram at miss_Jessies_speech_world, Miss Jessie Speech World on Instagram. I'm very active on Instagram. I love sharing information about GLPs as well as the other special interest areas I have within the field. And you are always welcome to DM me there if you have any questions or thoughts or want to talk about this a bit more. I'm going to take a look at the chat and see if we have any questions here. At what age do signs of Gestalt language processing typically become noticeable? That is an excellent question. You can actually see the signs of this early on before a child is even using any words from their mouth, but they're quite subtle. Usually when a child first starts using language and you can hear the things that they're saying, even if you can't really make out the words. Once you hear a child start making any vocalizations, if you notice that intonation pattern and what they're humming or what they're sort of quote unquote jargoning, you can start to recognize the signs of them being a GLP. It is not uncommon either for GLPs to be quote unquote late talkers and not to really say some of their first words until a little later than we would typically expect. Sometimes that is because they have this long chunk of language, but they motorically with their mouth can't say it yet. So those might come out more around like 2 or 3 years of age. But even with young children who aren't yet using real mouth words, we sometimes will hear them repeat back using immediate echolalia, using humming, and repeating back the things we've said. So for an example, with a young child I worked with a few years ago who was 2, she wasn't yet using any words from her mouth, but I would say things like, let's go get a snack. And then she would hum. She would hum back my intonation to me, which told me she's a Gestalt language processor. She is processing and storing the information I said, maybe also confirming to me that she wants to get a snack by humming back the intonation of what I've just said to her. Hopefully that's helpful on that question. I'm just going to wait another minute or two to see if we have any other questions. I do also have at the end of this, if you're interested, my references are here, as well as I think I have some other great sources of information here as well on like where to find more information about GLPs. Another question, what practical tips can parents use at home to support their child's communication journey? Really good question. When I was first coming up in the field, before I even went to graduate school to become an SLP, when I was working with autistic kids at a large clinic that was doing research and therapy for autistic kids, I was taught at that time that echolalia should be ignored and that we should try to extinguish it because it was quote unquote meaningless, okay? Wow, was that completely wrong? And I really understand that now. So if that is still, and I think that is still being shared in a lot of places, if that's what you're being told, if that's what you're hearing, I want you to throw that out the window, throw it away. The best thing that you can do at home, especially if you have a child who is autistic and you suspect might be a GLP, is validate and acknowledge everything that you hear them say. Truly. If you hear them repeat a script, you might go, oh, yes, interesting. Tell me more. right? Just lean in and listen and validate and treat everything that they say as communication that you are interested in hearing, even if you don't understand what it means. You might even maybe repeat it back to them using the intonation that they use to see if they have a little sparkle in their eye, if they get a little smile. It's really going to drive the connection between you to show your child that I don't fully understand how you're developing language or what it is that you're trying to communicate, but I am listening and I am invested and I am here to help you as your communication partner work through this journey. The other really, really great thing you can do is learn more about Gestalt language processing. If you are lucky enough to have a GLP knowledgeable SLP or therapist somewhere in the area where you live, and you can learn more from them and collaborate with them on supporting your child's language journey, that is really fabulous. But those would be like my top two. Okay, next question. What should I look for in a speech therapist who understands GLP? Um, there are some places where you can check to see if there are NLA trained SLPs in your area. One of them is the first link that's on this resource page here, which is at the end of the slideshow. Communication Development Center has a NLA database where they have a list of all the NLA trained SLPs. I am not actually positive if that is just in the US or worldwide, but I know that there are NLA trained SLPs throughout the world. It is becoming like a global movement. Meaningful Speech, that website, which is the second one down, also has an NLA directory where you can search for NLA trained SLPs. But really, even if you can't find in a directory somewhere that there's an NLA GLP, it would be great to interview a speech therapist before you begin working with them and ask them these questions. Have you heard of Gestalt language processing? If yes, what do you know about it? How do you work with GLPs in understanding that they develop language differently, and really understanding, like making sure that they understand what it is and how to support GLPs? Because if they are only coming at language development from an ALP lens, from that analytic lens, they won't be as successful in supporting the child and could potentially do some damage. It's relatively unlikely, but it could unintentionally give the kid just a ton more scripts, which don't actually become flexible. They could be requiring a child to repeat back language, which won't actually support them in gaining flexible and self-generated autonomous language. It could be just more frustrating for the child to work with somebody who only understands language through that lens. So I would say that finding somebody who at least has heard of GLP and is open and interested and curious about learning more, that's a really good quality to find in a speech therapist for sure. Okay, next question. Oh no, there are no other questions, but thank you guys so much for having me today. If you do have more questions or thoughts after this presentation, please feel free to contact me. I really value engagement, and I'm just, yeah, very honored to have been asked to come today. So thank you guys so much, and we will wrap it up here. Bye. Bye, you guys.